Hello, class. This is lecture number 4 for History 102. And as you remember, last time we left off with the massacre at Wounded Knee. So we want to wrap up that chapter on the West in your textbook. And you can also take a close look at the mini lecture on the West, because I'm not going to really talk about a couple of things. You can explore the links and so forth for yourself and read your textbook. I'm not really going to talk about the cattle frontier. You're going to want to take a look at that in your textbook. There's a very telling picture entitled Dress to Kill on page 592 in your text that shows some cowboys of the time, and really cowboys rose up because of the cattle frontier that emerged in Texas that you can read about. Also, there's map 25.3 on that same page, 592, that shows you the different trails like the Chisholm Trail and the Goodnight Trail and whatnot, where cattle were driven from Texas all the way up to train heads or railheads as they're known, up in Kansas, mainly, like Dodge City, which was a very important place, and one of these cow towns of what became known as the Wild Wild West. But in reality, the Wild Wild West was a myth. There was strict gun control in these cities, and as we talked about earlier, the place that was violent was the East, the wild, wild cities of the East, where people were shooting each other on the streets. This didn't really occur in the West. Hollywood made everybody think it did, and so did the dime novels that were very popular and printed at the time. But you can explore that on your own. So what I want to talk about to wrap this chapter up is something that was way more important to millions of Americans. That's homesteading. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, signed into law by President Lincoln, and basically what it did was open up the West to settlement. Now remember, the federal government had more land than they knew what to do with west of the Mississippi, and they sort of got into the business of giving it away. They gave away tremendous amounts to the railroads that we covered earlier in class. Now they're going to start giving it away to individuals like you and I. According to the Homestead Act, for a nominal fee, and in the beginning in 1862, the fee was $10. You would get a 160-acre plot, which is 1/4 square mile, somewhere out west, where you could start living and farming. And the only requirements for this land to become yours forever, besides paying the $10 registration fee, was you had to live on it and cultivate it for 5 years. If you did that, then the deed became official and it was your land forever. Now, this is going to exist from 1862 until 1890. And more than 500,000 Americans will take advantage of this and get their own 160-acre plots. Now, it's not going to be easy. Settling out in the Great Plains and other areas is going to be extremely difficult because you're out there on your own. Most people that go out there spend all their money getting there on a covered wagon. They'll build homes out of sod. It'll be a real struggle because today Americans think about, whoa, what a deal. 160 acres for $10. Where do I sign up? You had to get there basically by wagon train, then carve your existence in the middle of nowhere with you and your family, and it wasn't easy. It was a real struggle. So you earned your 160 acres. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of different innovations will help these homesteaders, as they're known, over time, but it still is a real struggle to settle out there. Now, the homesteading will all come to an end by 1890. But what's going to be the real final chapter in this homesteading is the land rush that takes place in the present-day state of Oklahoma. So, let me tell you a little bit about this final chapter in homesteading. Now, in previous lectures, we talked about the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act dissolved reservations. And after Native American people got their 160-acre plots, sound familiar? That's what the government liked to hand out. It created about 90 million acres of what was considered by the government surplus land. And the government, according to the Dawes Act, could sell this land, and the revenue from the land would then fund farming equipment for Native Americans and also fund the boarding schools. A tremendous amount of this, quote unquote, surplus land was in what becomes Oklahoma. Because before this time period, and in a period that we didn't study in this class, but if you took History 101, you studied it, there was a period in the Jackson administration known as Indian removal, when more than 90 Native American tribes that did live east of the Mississippi River were relocated to what was known as the Indian Territory, which at the time in the 1830s was the middle of nowhere in an area that becomes the state of Oklahoma. Now, some of the most famous removals that you're all probably pretty aware of, at least the names of, were the removal of the Cherokee, known as the Trail of Tears, and so on. But, this is going to become a giant area of Indian reservations. But then the Dawes Act will dissolve them. So this is going to be a place where there's a lot of surplus land. So the government decides to put an end to homesteading and starts thinking about this as early as 1887, 88, when the Dawes Act is passed. They're going to decide to have one last big rush for this land in Oklahoma, and it's going to take place in April of 1889. But they're going to advertise this event for a year before it takes place. It's going to be advertised in newspapers in the United States, newspapers in Europe, basically telling people this is your last chance. If you want to be a homesteader, you're going to have to come to this last land rush that's going to take place. So, what's going to happen here is this whole thing's going to take place on April 22nd, 1889. And the way that they set it up is everybody can go into Oklahoma before this time period and scout around. See if there's a desirable piece of land that you might want. Some land had natural water sources, some didn't, some was more fertile than others. So you could go around and look around. Now, all the 160-acre plots had a small flag that was posted right in the middle of the plot, and it had a number on it. So the way this was all going to work, on April 22nd, people were going to line up around the border of Oklahoma. And at noon, they'd fire off cannon, ring bells, or whatever as the signal. You could rush in to grab the flag of a particular piece of land that you might want more than others. So this is how it's a land rush. So on that day, somewhere between 50 to 100,000 people lined up around Oklahoma. We don't know for sure. People from all around the United States, people from Europe came here. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, his first wife. It's about this event. It's a pretty good movie. Look it up on Netflix. I'd suggest watching it. Name of the film again is Far and Away. Now, so they all rush in to grab these flags. And then what's going to happen once you have a flag, you go to a government processing center. One of these processing centers was set up in central Oklahoma. It will become the city of Oklahoma City. On the morning of April 22nd, the only people that were in Oklahoma, what will become Oklahoma City, were government processors ready to process these claims. By nightfall that night, it had a population of 10,000 people with their flags waiting in line to have their claims processed. So, not only did people come to Oklahoma to make these land claims, some smart entrepreneurs went to the places where the government processing stations were, like Oklahoma City, and they set up tent restaurants to serve food to these people. Some very cunning entrepreneurs even built outhouses that they charged admission to in places like Oklahoma City. So you have all this massive land rush of people rushing in to grab more prime pieces of land than others. And this is where a term comes about also concerning Oklahoma. Some people cheated when they went, on this land rush on April 22nd, 1889. They snuck in the day before and hid out. Then when the signals went off at noon on April 22nd, they sort of jumped out of the weeds, grabbed prime pieces of land because they cheated and were there already, and they got the best pieces of land in Oklahoma. Those people are known as the Sooners because they got there sooner than everybody else did. So, really, the Oklahoma Sooners were cheaters. Now, that's one thing that signals the end of the American frontier in U.S. history. 1890 is an extremely important date. It's a turning point in American history because the following things happen. The frontier comes to a close. We've settled the continent, Atlantic to Pacific, and the government gets out of the business of giving away free land once and for all. Also, as we know what happens in 1890, it's the end of Indian resistance for the next 75 years. No longer does anybody worry about traveling out west being attacked by so-called renegade Indians. They've all been rounded up and placed first on reservations. Now supposedly they're transforming into good little farmers thanks to the Dawes Act. All this takes place in 1890. It's a big change for America. We had always depended upon having a frontier to continually move westward, having a lot of available, inexpensive land for expansion of America as we knew it. Well, now we're all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Those days are over. On the Moodle site in the West lecture, or mini lecture, I've given you a link to the famous essay, The Significance of the American Frontier in U.S. History by Frederick Jackson Turner. It's a very important document. Turner wrote this just 3 years after all of this took place. He wrote it in 1893, and he identified the turning point just 3 years after it happened. It's a significant historical essay written by Turner, who was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, one of those land grant institutions that was created by the Morrill Land Grant. And it's a significant piece of American history. I gave you a copy of that speech that he delivered. You can see it online. And he really does point out something that's going to change America just 3 years after it happened. It's almost as significant as Mark Twain identifying the Gilded Age while he was living through it. That doesn't happen very often. So, one other thing that I want to mention that takes place in this particular time period. We already talked about politics, and we got to get back to politics once again. We're into the 1890s, and one very significant thing that's going to happen in the 1890s after the $1 billion Congress is the Panic of 1892. It's the worst depression in American history up to that point. The only time we had a more severe economic downturn was the Great Depression, when we experienced prolonged unemployment of 25% or more in the late 20s into the 1930s. Unemployment in the Panic of 1892 is going to reach about 20%. It's a horrible downturn, and it's really going to turn politics around in America. Unfortunately, President Cleveland, who was elected for his second term in the election of 1892, takes office, and the Panic of 1893 hits almost immediately. So it's going to occupy his second term in office. He's the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, but it's going to set up the election of 1896 as a monumental election. The country's still trying to pull out of the Panic of 1893, and it's going to set up an election between William McKinley from Ohio versus William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat. And you can read in the textbook, but in this very significant election, William McKinley will be backed by big business, run a campaign from the front porch of his house in Canton, Ohio, and defeat the young, energetic William Jennings Bryan, who travels all across the country by train, delivering speech after speech. And McKinley will take over as President of the United States when he's sworn in March of 1897. It's a significant switch in American political history. It'll usher in a whole new way of thinking led by McKinley, and will ultimately, unwittingly, lead to the progressive era, because we're going to be talking about how the world changes dramatically. And one of the big events that happened during McKinley's first term in office was the Spanish-American War. So that's it for lecture number 4 for History 102. We'll pick up next. We're going to talk about the Spanish-American War and how America transcends into a world power and move forward in the chapters in your textbook. So try to review all the mini lectures. Go to those links. And reminder, your extra credit essays due Sunday. So don't forget to do that. It's, could help a lot of you with your final grades. So next time, we'll be focusing in on America as a world power, and we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War. So everybody take care, follow the governor's orders, be safe and stay home, and we'll defeat this COVID-19, especially up here in the North Country. I think we've got it under control, but we've got to maintain what we're doing. Take care. Bye now.